The grizzly was standing between her and the cabin when Oren Hale finally crested the ridge. For a wild second, his breath caught, not from fear, but from disbelief. The woman wasn't screaming. She was scratching behind the bear's ears like it was an oversized dog, and the animal, 800 pounds of fur and teeth, was leaning into her hand with a low, rumbling sound that wasn't quite a growl. "His name is Jasper," she called out, not turning around. I figured that suited him. Oren lowered his rifle. 15 years alone in the Bitterroot range, and he'd seen plenty of strange things. But this? A city woman standing in his clearing, petting the bear he'd raised from a cub, talking like they were old friends? This was new. 3 days earlier, Oren had been checking his trapline when he found the wagon. It was a hired rig from Stillwater, overturned in a shallow creek bed. The driver was gone, likely spooked and run off, but the supplies were still strapped down, soaked and ruined. And sitting on a flat rock beside the wreck, wringing out her skirt with the calm efficiency of a woman who'd long since stopped expecting help, was her. She didn't startle when he stepped into view. She just looked up, took in his size, 6'5", shoulders like an axe handle, scarred knuckles and a beard halfway down his chest, and said, "You live near here?" Her voice was steady. No tremor. No tears. "Close enough," Oren said. "Good. I need shelter until I can wire Stillwater for another wagon." He should have said no. Should have pointed her back toward town and let her figure it out. He didn't know anyone anything, and that's how he'd kept his peace for a decade and a half. But the sun was already sinking, and the wolves had been bold this season. He nodded once and turned back up the trail. She followed without question. By the time they reached the clearing, dusk had settled in thick and purple. The cabin sat solid against the pines, rough-hewn but weather-tight. Smoke curled from the chimney. And sitting on the porch, one paw draped over the other, was Jasper. The woman stopped short. "That's a bear." "He is," Oren said. "On your porch. He likes the shade." She set her soap bag down and walked straight toward the animal. Oren started to bark a warning, but before he could get the words out, she crouched in front of Jasper and held out her hand, palm up. The bear sniffed once, then nudged her wrist with his massive snout. "Hello," she murmured. "You're a gentleman, aren't you?" Jasper made a low, pleased sound and flopped onto his side. Oren stared. She looked back over her shoulder. "Does he have a name?" "No." "Well, he does now." She stood, brushed dirt off her hands, and walked past Oren into the cabin like she'd been invited. "I'm calling him Jasper." Inside, the fire was still crackling. She sat at the rough table without waiting to be offered a chair, pulled the tin cup toward her, and poured herself water from the jug. Oren stood in the doorway, caught somewhere between irritation and fascination. "You got a name?" he asked. "Margot Bellamy." She drank half the cup in one pull. "Widow. Former schoolteacher. Currently unemployed and moderately stranded. Oren Hale." "Pleased to meet you, Mr. Hale." She set the cup down. "Now? How long before I can get word to Stillwater?" "Trading post is 2 days' walk south. If you wait till morning, I'll take you." 2 days. On foot. 3 if it rains. Margot studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "All right. I'll stay the night. I'll sleep on the floor. I won't touch your things. And I'll pay you for the trouble." "Don't need payment. Then I'll cook breakfast." He almost smiled. "Almost. Deal." She did cook. Sourdough flatbread and fried salt pork from his stores, cooked with the precise efficiency of a woman who'd fed herself long before she'd fed anyone else. They ate in silence, the firelight making shadows of them both. When she finished, she rinsed the plates, set them to dry, and lay down on the floor near the hearth with her coat rolled under her head. Oren watched from the corner buck. She didn't fidget, didn't sigh, just closed her eyes and went still, like sleep was a job she'd learned to do well. He should have felt relief when morning came. Should have been glad to walk her down to the post and send her back to whatever life she'd left. But when dawn broke and he opened the door, Margot was already outside, sitting cross-legged in the dirt, with Jasper's head in her lap. The bear's eyes were half closed in contentment. Margot was humming something low and tuneless, her fingers working through the coarse fur behind his ears. She looked up when Oren stepped onto the porch. "He's lonely," she said simply. "You know that, don't you?" Oren froze. And for the first time in 15 years, he didn't have an answer. Oren didn't take her to the trading post that morning. He told himself it was because the weather looked uncertain, clouds building dark over the ridge. Told himself Jasper was acting strange and needed watching. Told himself a dozen small lies that didn't quite hold. The truth was simpler. Margot Bellamy had said something out loud that he'd been trying not to think for 3 years. Jasper was lonely, and so was he. She didn't push. When Oren said they'd wait another day, she just nodded and set about making herself useful. She swept the cabin floor, mended a tear in his oilskin coat without asking, built up the fire, and made stew from dried venison and wild onions she found growing near the creek. She worked with the quiet competence of someone who didn't need thanks or approval, who simply did what needed doing because that's who she was. And every few hours, she'd step outside to sit with Jasper. By the second evening, Oren couldn't help himself. He stood in the doorway, watching as she scratched the bear's jaw and talked to him in that low, steady voice. "He was a cub when I found him," Oren said. Margot looked up. His mother had been shot by hunters. Left him in a den, half-starved. "I didn't plan on keeping him. Just figured I'd feed him till he was strong enough to go." "But he stayed," Margot said. "He stayed." She looked back at Jasper, who was now sprawled flat on his back, paws in the air. "Why didn't you give him a name?" Oren leaned against the doorframe. "Didn't seem right. Naming something ties you to it. Makes it harder when it leaves." Margot's expression shifted. Something sad and knowing passed over her face. "Everything leaves eventually, Mr. Hale. A name doesn't change that. It just means they mattered while they were here." He didn't have an answer for that either. That night, Margot finally told him why she'd come to the mountains. They sat by the fire, the cabin warm and close. She stared into the flames, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of pine needle tea. "My husband died 2 years ago," she said. "Fever. It was fast. I kept teaching after, but the school board decided a widow wasn't appropriate for young children. They let me go last spring." "That's foolish," Oren said. "It's common." She took a sip. "I had a sister in Stillwater. She wrote that there was work in the logging camps, cooking, mending, bookkeeping. I sold what I had and hired the wagon. Then the driver saw a snake, spooked the horses, and ran off before I could stop him." "He left you?" "He did." Her voice was flat, matter of fact. "Men do that." Oren felt something tighten in his chest. "Not all of them." She looked at him then, really looked, and something softened in her face. "No, I suppose not." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that happens when two people stop pretending they don't see each other. On the third day, Oren finally decided they'd go to the trading post at first light. He told himself it was the right thing. Margot needed to move on. He needed his solitude back. But when he woke, Margot wasn't in the cabin. He found her outside, standing at the edge of the clearing. Jasper was beside her, his head low. And farther out, near the tree line, were 3 wolves. Oren's blood went cold. He grabbed his rifle and moved fast, but Margot didn't run. She stood perfectly still, one hand resting on Jasper's shoulder. The bear's hackles were up, his body tense, but he didn't charge. He waited. The lead wolf, a scarred gray female, took 2 steps forward. Jasper rumbled a warning, deep and guttural. The wolf stopped. Margot's voice cut through the standoff, calm and clear. "We're not prey, and you're not hungry enough to die proving otherwise." The wolf stared. Then, slowly, she turned and melted back into the trees. The others followed. Oren lowered the rifle. His hands were shaking. Margot walked back toward him, Jasper trailing at her heels. Her face was pale but composed. "You should have called for me," Oren said, his voice rougher than he meant. "You were asleep. And I had. Jasper. That doesn't," he stopped. Swallowed. "You could have been killed. But I wasn't." She met his eyes. "Because I wasn't alone." Something cracked open in Oren's chest. Something he'd kept locked for 15 years. He stepped closer. "Why'd you really come up here, Margot?" She didn't look away. "Because I was tired of being invisible. Tired of being told I was too much or not enough. I thought maybe in the mountains, none of that would matter." "It doesn't," Oren said quietly. "Not up here." "I know." Her voice softened. "I figured that out the moment I met Jasper. And you." He reached out then, slow and careful, and took her hand. Her fingers were cold. His were warm. They fit. "Stay," he said. "Not just tonight. Stay." Margot's breath caught. "You don't even know me." "I know enough." He squeezed her hand gently. "I know you're brave. I know you see things clearly. And I know Jasper won't let me hear the end of it if I let you leave." She laughed, a real, bright sound that filled the clearing like light. "All right," she said. "I'll stay." The trading post run happened a week later, but this time Margot went with him, not to leave, but to send word to her sister and buy supplies for winter. They walked the trail together, Jasper raging ahead, and Oren found himself talking more than he had in years. He told her about the ridge where eagles nested, the hot spring hidden past the North Fork, the winter he'd nearly lost his foot to frostbite. She listened, and then she told him about the students she'd loved teaching, the books she'd read by candlelight, the way she used to imagine a life bigger than the one she'd been handed. "You're living it now," Oren said. Margot smiled. "I think I am." At the post, the trader, a grizzled man named Calhoun, raised an eyebrow when he saw them together. "Didn't know you kept company, Hale." "I do now," Oren said simply. They bought flour, salt, wool blankets, and a small cast-iron stove. Margot added a bundle of books from Calhoun's dusty back shelf. Oren didn't argue. On the way back, she read to him by firelight, poetry and old stories, while Jasper dozed at their feet. Winter came hard and early that year. Snow piled 6 feet deep around the cabin. The world narrowed to firelight, warmth, and the steady rhythm of 2 people learning to live as one. Margot took over the cooking and the mending. Oren kept the wood stocked and the traps running. They worked in tandem, no wasted motion, no resentment. And Jasper, true to his nature, stayed close. He slept on the porch most nights, but when the cold bit deep, Margot would crack the door and let him in. He'd sprawl by the hearth, snoring like distant thunder, and she'd rest her hand on his side while she read. One night, deep in January, Oren sat across from her and said, "I don't want you to think you're trapped here." Margot looked up from her book. "I don't feel trapped. If you ever do, I won't." She set the book down. "Oren, I spent years in a town that saw me as a burden, a leftover. Here, I wake up and know I matter. Not because of what I've lost, but because of what I bring. You see me. Jasper sees me. That's not a trap. It's the first real freedom I've ever had." He crossed the room and knelt beside her chair, the way he'd done that first night. "Then marry me." She went still. "What? Not because it's proper. Not because you need protecting." He took her hand. "Because I don't want to spend another winter without you. Or another spring. Or anything else." Margot's eyes shone. Yes. They married in March, when the snow began to melt and the first green pushed through the mud. Calhoun rode up from the post to witness it, and they spoke their vows on the porch with Jasper sitting between them like a great furry witness. There was no preacher, no law, just 2 people choosing each other in the presence of the wild. By summer, Margot had turned the cabin into something more: shelves for books, curtains on the windows, a small garden plot where she grew herbs and potatoes. Oren built her a chair that fit her frame, carved with careful detail. She ran her fingers over the armrests and kissed him so hard, he nearly dropped his coffee. One August evening, they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the ridge. Jasper lay between them, his breathing slow and even. Margot leaned into Oren's side. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked. "Being alone?" Oren thought about it. Really thought. "No," he said. "I thought I needed the quiet. Turns out I just needed the right person to share it with." She smiled. "Jasper found me first, you know." "I know. He knew before you did. He's smarter than me." Margot laughed, and the sound echoed across the clearing, warm and alive and entirely theirs. Years later, trappers passing through the Bitterroots would tell stories about the mountain man and his wife, the ones who lived high in the timber with a bear that answered to a name. Some said the woman was a witch. Others said the man had gone feral. But the ones who actually made it to the clearing, the ones brave or desperate enough, came away with a different story. They spoke of a cabin filled with firelight and the smell of bread, of a tall, quiet man who offered shelter without question, of a sharp-eyed woman who could stitch a wound or argue philosophy with equal skill, and of a bear named Jasper, who sat between them like a guardian, content and unshakably loyal. It wasn't a story of rescue. It was a story of recognition. 2 people who had been invisible to the world, seen at last by each other. And by a bear who knew, long before anyone else, that sometimes the lost find each other not by searching, but by simply being exactly who they are. In the end, the wilderness didn't make them whole. They did that themselves. The mountains just gave them the space to do it.